been another great shift in the Pauper format, and I can't help but think it's because of a specific stat line, the 1-drop with haste. Not necessarily the 1/1 with haste, but the stat line of the 1-drop with haste has been a very contentious one. Over Magic's history, the idea of a 1-drop, a kind of first turn play, having haste, being able to go in aggressively, has been a problematic one so far, to the point that even Monastery Swiftspear has been banned. But I mean, Taylor Swift herself being legal in the Pauper format was a little problematic just because of its like long-term viability. And so burn really evolved through the ages as these cards kind of waxed and waned in playability. And so I wanted to talk about that today. I wanted to go through some of the 1-drops that have existed throughout Pauper, ones that still do exist, and also ultimately land on the perfect 1-drop, the perfect 1-drop with haste that exists in Pauper right now, that is changing the landscape of how burn plays. And maybe just bringing forth the idea of maybe we need to maybe not ban it, but again, take a look at that menace of artifacts that has existed in the format for so long. Now, if you want to see more discussion videos like this, obviously leave a like on the video. Let me know what you want me to talk about. And of course, if you want the memes to stay on these videos, then you just gotta let me know. You gotta comment down below, okay? I'm trying to bring them back slowly. But anyway, Pauper metagame. Not too long ago, you would have seen a bit of a change to this. You would have seen Jund Brood-Scale at the top, with Grixis Affinity probably second, Burn somewhere at the top, but now Burn is almost double the percentage of the top of the next top deck. Grixis Affinity. I mean, Pauper has favored aggression for many of meta, right? Like, I mean, Bogles is a aggressive deck. Madness Burn is literally a burn deck. Dimir Terror is like less of a control deck and more of like a tempo, almost like, I don't know, it's still kind of mid-rangey aggro, right? And Jund Brood-Scale, obviously a combo deck that wants to go super fast. Blue Terror, again, more so a tempo deck. The black version just tends to have like more removal, all that type of stuff. The format has favored aggro. And so when it comes to decks like Brood-Scale that want to be super fast, it's really interesting when you see decks that are more favored or faster. Maybe decks that have more removal can get out and underneath you a lot faster. And the Brood-Scale combo is still really powerful. It's what many Pauper players would consider Pauper Splinter Twin in many ways. It kind of goes off late, it's pretty definite, but it has some like alternate lines of play in many ways that do allow it to go out and over top, abusing some of the more powerful cards that have been printing recently, including like Malevolent Rumble being able to ramp. But when it comes to a list like Burn, there's a lot of 1-drops here that I think like have a lot of interesting value. So Kuldotha Rebirth, I would say in the last like 5 years has been a really interesting addition. This has been more so like a mid-range card. You would have seen this in like the Boros mid-range decks more so, like Kuldotha mid-range and everything. Galvanic Blast, again, a mainstay of the artifact decks now, especially with the printing of like Experimental Synthesizer. Definitely a deck that like shifted the way we think about mid-range and aggro. Lightning Bolt still a classic. And Chain Lightning, really surprised that like this still like sees that level of play. I mean, I guess it really is the best option, but especially if Burn is at the top, if red is everywhere, giving your opponent access to cast something like Chain Lightning provides that back and forth. But all the artifacts in here alongside Galvanic Blast are really interesting to take into account, especially with Voldir and Epicure creating a blood token for you to use. Now Clockwork Percussionist also joining that kind of dance there. And we're ultimately going to land at why like Clockwork Percussionist is probably one of the more busted 1-drops ever printed at Common. Coming out recently, you know, 1-drop, 1/1 with haste artifact creature. When Clockwork Percussionist dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. So we're going to break this all down in a second here, but just note Clockwork Percussionist is the reason why Burn is playable here. Now, if you look at kind of creatures that are kind of 1-drops legal in Pauper, specifically, I wanted to note legal in Pauper. This is, again, excluding Monastery Swiftspear. We all know why that card is busted at this point. Just having the prowess and forcing your opponent to think about its stat line, attacking and blocking kind of later in the game. It was just a really powerful threat off the rip, and in a lot of ways you were playing against decks that were able to kind of pump it out of removal range against the red deck, so the mirrors became like really problematic. But honestly, there's a whole lot of options out here. Now, some of these don't necessarily have haste. They just, you know, kind of, I searched up haste in the text box and that's what came up. So some of them may be giving haste, but shout out to cool cards like Uktabi Drake that have like an echo cost. It has flying and haste as a 2/1. So like, this is a really cool creature, but like, I don't know, maybe is there a world where something like this like has value? I don't know. I just thought it was like a cool option when I was looking through this. But Goblin Tomb Raider is like the big one right now because it is the kind of monastery swift spear of the format. If you were to start off with a Great Furnace and then play into this, then it's a 1-drop with 2/2 and haste. So Goblin Tomb Raider, very reasonable as to why it's powerful, in that 2 damage off early. It's why Goblin Guide, being that consistent 1-drop 2/2 in modern, is a really powerful burn spell. Giving your opponent that land is perfectly fine, and in many ways it's actually information for you, because then you get to see what your opponent is drawing. If it's not a land, maybe you see a counter spell and you play out a little bit differently. So in many ways, Goblin Guide's ability can be used in your favor. Goblin Bushwhacker has been a staple in the burn decks for a very long time at this point, because the burn deck has decided to go wide. I think the format has gone like really interactive in its ability to stop combo decks and with blue everywhere. So you don't necessarily want to be relying on that slow engine of where burn was, throwing instant and sorcery spells at your opponent and setting up like a long game where you'd have those spells that, you know, you'd kind of tap it to deal 1, and then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, that card would untap and then you would have to tap it again to deal 1. Like this kind of slow building up is not what this format wants right now, especially with combo at the top. That was more so like a turn, you know, 3 deck, turn 4 deck, but you really had to set up to even get there. So it was a bit of a slower burn. Here you want to kind of burst out of nowhere, get a Kuldotha Rebirth out, Goblin Bushwhacker, all of a sudden you're hitting with an insanely wide board into your opponent's face. So burn is very much like a zoo deck more so. So it brings about more of the kind of old ways of zoo and aggro and burn. It's not really spell centric. So a lot of people like it from an aggro perspective. So Goblin Bushwhacker, that 1/1, technically with haste, you do have to kick her. But yeah, so Gitu Lava Runner is one I want to mention because this is one that has been around. It was the quote unquote Goblin Guide at a certain point when it was printed. You needed to have 2 or more instant and sorceries card in your graveyard. So it's one of those things where you needed to start off with the bolt, then you play Gitu Lava Runner, and then it's a 1-drop with 2/2 and haste. So there was a little bit of setting up to be done, but you could also play this on 1, have it out. It's a 1/2, pretty hard for your opponent to deal with in that sense. And then like they would have to throw a removal spell at it, and that way that removal spell is cleared out. You can play out your other spells and your other creatures. So Gitu Lava Runner was definitely a staple at some point. Ginger Brute, we've all known and loved. This card is definitely just going to be coming back at some point in Pauper. We were throwing, you know, what's that enchantment? I'm forgetting it right now. White and 1, +1/+1 for each other artifact, or actually not each other, each artifact enchantment on the battlefield. The reason it was great on this is because you can activate this for 1, and Ginger Brute can't be blocked except by creatures with haste. Now, at a time, there weren't too many creatures with haste, but in the mirror, in that matchup, it was in that affinity mirror, it was really interesting because you could play Ginger Brute to block your opponent's opposing Ginger Brute, but then also in the mirror, you could tap this and sacrifice this to gain 3 life. So it was great in that mirror as well. Sorry, not even in the mirror. Sorry, I'm saying it's great against burn. So a 1-drop with haste, it's great against burn. That's great in the mirror matchup that it existed in. Ginger Brute will be back in the metagame at some point or another. And one card I really want to shout out, I'm surprised that this doesn't meet the cut. I think it's because, I mean, I guess its activated ability is too much, but it's a 1-drop as a 1/2 with first strike and haste. Okay, so even if it gets chumped by a 1/1, you're just going to get that first damage off, right? Like maybe, you know, they're trying to like ping you for 1, or they're trying to do something with some shenanigan. I guess it's because you can't really buff it. It is just a 1/2 with haste. It's not a 1/1 with haste, but it gains that extra, you know, kind of ability there. And then you can sacrifice this for 3, draw a card and create a treasure token. So it's kind of like 2, like you get the 1 back. Like, I don't know. I feel like Reckless Lackey, like it has something to it, right? I mean, 3 is a lot, to be fair. That's kind of like, that 1 artifacts. Oh my God, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but where is it? The experimental synthesizer. Yeah, that's like experimental synthesizers, like activated ability. You create a 2/2 off that with vigilance. It's a lot better. If your opponent has protection from red, now that 2/2 can attack in. So there's like a lot of things that experimental synthesizer gives you, but I feel like this is a pretty decent 1-drop with haste, especially with first strike. You get that little bit of ramp. I don't know, right? Like this has to be playable. Someone let me know in the comment section down below. Why isn't Reckless Lackey playable? Like, does it just not meet the cut? Is it just kind of missing that extra sauce? Like, it costs too much to draw a card, it doesn't buff itself. Like, I don't know. I feel like this is kind of one of those like late game, pretty decent drops. Also shout out to Banehound. This is one of those cards that a lot of people are thinking about, like, how do you use this, right? It's not in mono red, but lifelink and haste on a 1/1. I feel like this card is like, it's always on the cusp. There's going to be some place, you know, it's never been reprinted, but there's going to be some place where this card is going to be playable. So I mean, I'm really excited to see where Banehound goes. But back to Clockwork Percussionist, where we see this card stand out over others is simply the synergy of being an artifact. A 1/1 with haste. I mean, the other bonus side of it is absolutely amazing as well, but having this be that 1-drop where you could go, you know, turn 1 Great Furnace into a Clockwork Percussion, that's already 3 artifacts. Then you go Mountain into something like a 1-drop artifact, or, you know, the creature that creates a blood token, and then already your Galvanic Blast is all online. One of the best burn spells in the Pauper format right now, and the artifact engine is one that's been through a whole lot of controversy already. Many of you watching this probably already know that, and I'm not sure if this card is going to be banned. I think it's just another one of those things where it slowly is adding to the case against the whole artifact package, and like, you know, should we ban the bridges, like the tap bridges? Should we ban the original artifact lands? Like, where does the artifact synergy start, and where do we take the idea of like format identity, and how much does it get warped around cards like this? Like, Clockwork Percussionist doesn't really strike me as a card that necessarily needs to get banned. It's not necessarily powerful, but it demands an answer, because when Clockwork Percussionist dies, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. So pretty much you get in for some combat. You're already tapped out. You don't have to worry about that card. You could tap, kind of attack in, and especially in those late game scenarios where your opponent's kind of trickling down to like 5, 4, 3 life, you almost have to let the Clockwork Percussionist go, because if your opponent, but if you block this and your opponent draws then the lightning bolt, then you have to worry about that after the fact. So it's almost like an unblockable effect. It's an immediate like 1 damage that your opponent cannot block. They cannot stop. They can block it early, but if they block it early, then you might be able to get a land drop out of the way where you don't play that land. It just takes it off the top of your library, where, you know, that kind of impulse style draw of red is even more powerful than drawing the card, because sometimes you just don't want the card in your hand, albeit you are a deck that produces blood tokens, so sometimes having that extra card does have value in that sense. But again, being able to play it until the end of your next turn, really powerful. Just being able to attack, and then even if your opponent kills it on their turn, it's not something like where you have to immediately play that card and immediately get rid of it, where there are lines against the 1-drop artifact that we were just talking about that creates a 2/2 with vigilance. If your opponent does kill that on your turn, then there are kind of some synergies with that, like where if we kind of go back to the text here, when Experimental Synthesizer enters or leaves the battlefield, exile the top card of your library until the end of turn. You may play that card. So if you were to kill that and your opponent, and you didn't want your opponent to make the 2/2, then you could kill that there. Maybe the exile like a creature, maybe the exile land, something that they can't use, and then they draw into something else. So it's a way to get rid of something, whereas this, you don't run into that situation. So being an artifact, having haste, drawing a card off the top, like really that power creep of what it means to be a 1-drop with haste. And I feel like, again, this card really exemplifies, as I mentioned for the 3rd or 4th time at this point, the problem with the artifact decks. And this is coming from a long time Affinity player. The moment I started playing Pauper, I was playing Affinity. I've been playing Affinity for so long in this format, and I recognize that at this point, if we're going to be printing type lines like this, we're going to have some real problems, because, you know, we're slowly starting to introduce the idea of like enchantment lands. We got that out of like Valkavat's Lair. So I'm really curious to see if we could get like an affinity mechanic, but for enchantment. So it would just be affinity for enchantments. You wouldn't call, like, it would still be affinity, but it would be like enchantment affinity, because affinity is like kind of past the idea of just being now related to artifacts. We have affinity for so many things, like affinity for basics and all that stuff. And so having affinity for enchantments could be a really cool way to introduce this into Pauper, having the enchantment lands. And we see that type of design space being explored not only in Valkavat's Lair, but we see it also in the test cards, in the kind of bonus packs that you see in the cons and everything. And so we could see this inform like future design. So I'm really curious to see how those will be implemented into the Pauper format, and maybe as an alternative to introduce another busted line. Like maybe we have a Galvanic Blast that now, you know, works with enchantment. And like, does that make it too busted, where we have artifact lands and enchantment lands? Does the artifact enchantments working together make it too powerful? I don't know. I think the 1-drops with haste are a really powerful stat line. It's a really interesting place for Pauper to explore, but when you get designs like this, it can really just not hurt the burn decks, but hurt the case for artifacts staying in the format.